The air in the small examination room was thick with the scent of carbolic acid and despair. Outside, the relentless Texas sun of 1884 beat down upon the dusty, forsaken town of Redemption, but inside Dr. Alastair Finch's infirmary, a perpetual twilight seemed to reign. Eleanor Vance clutched the hand of her 7-year-old son, Thomas. His skin was pale, almost translucent, and a deep, rattling cough echoed in his chest, a sound that had become the soundtrack to her sleepless nights. Consumption, they called it, a death sentence whispered on the wind. She had watched it take her husband, and now it had come for her boy. Dr. Finch was her last hope, an enigmatic figure who had arrived in Redemption a year prior, a man educated in the hallowed halls of European medicine, a stark contrast to the frontier sawbones she had known her whole life. He finished his examination, his movements precise and unnervingly calm. His face, framed by dark hair and a meticulously trimmed beard, was a mask of detached professionalism. He said nothing for a long moment, his gaze fixed on the boy's frail form. The silence stretched, each second a hammer blow against Eleanor's fragile hope. Finally, he turned to her. His voice was low, devoid of warmth. "The standard treatments are insufficient," he stated, a fact Eleanor already knew with sickening certainty. He walked to a heavy oak cabinet, the only ornate piece of furniture in the sparse room. He unlocked it with a small brass key and withdrew a small leather pouch tied shut with a wax string. It was surprisingly heavy for its size. He placed it on the table between them. "This is a proprietary compound," he explained, his eyes meeting hers for the first time. They were a startlingly cold gray. "It is unconventional but potent." He pushed the pouch toward her. "1 spoonful, mixed with water. Administered only after dusk. Do you understand?" Eleanor, desperate, nodded numbly. As her fingers closed around the pouch, a fine, gritty powder shifted within. She could not possibly conceive of the horrifying truth of its contents, or the macabre bargain she was about to make in the shadows of Redemption. The prescription was not an herb, not a chemical concoction. It was something far more forbidden. The walk home was a blur. The weight of the pouch in Eleanor's apron pocket felt like a stone, both a burden and a strange, desperate anchor. The dust of Redemption's single, bleak street swirled around her ankles, kicked up by a hot, dry wind that offered no relief. The town itself seemed to be gasping for breath, its clapboard buildings bleached gray by the unforgiving sun. Redemption wasn't a place people chose. It was a place they ended up, a last resort on the ragged edge of the frontier. It was a town built on failed dreams and shallow graves, where life was cheap and death was a constant, familiar neighbor. Diseases like consumption, cholera, and influenza moved through the populace like phantom reapers, their work made easy by the harsh conditions and the crushing poverty. Dr. Alastair Finch's arrival had been a strange sort of miracle. He was a man of science and learning in a land governed by superstition and raw survival. He didn't make house calls to pray with the dying. He brought instruments of gleaming steel and bottles of strange-smelling liquids. He set bones with an expert's touch and sutured wounds with a surgeon's precision. He was respected, but he was not liked. His manner was too cold, his gaze too analytical. He looked at the townsfolk not as people, but as collections of symptoms, biological machines in various states of disrepair. He lived alone in the large house that doubled as his infirmary, a place children hurried past, whispering stories of the strange sounds and smells that emanated from it late at night. That evening, as the sun bled across the horizon, painting the sky in violent hues of orange and purple, Eleanor prepared the first dose. She opened the leather pouch. A fine, grayish-white powder clung to the inside. It had a faint, chalky, almost metallic odor. Her hands trembled as she measured out a single spoonful, her heart pounding with a mixture of hope and a nameless, creeping dread. She was placing her faith in a man no one truly knew, and a medicine no one had ever heard of. She was about to give her son the dust of the dead. Within 3 days, the change in Thomas was undeniable. It was not a sudden, miraculous recovery, but a slow, creeping return of life. The deep, rattling cough that had shaken his small frame began to subside, replaced by a shallower, less frequent rasp. A faint blush of color returned to his cheeks, chasing away the ghostly pallor that had haunted his mother for months. He began to take broth, then solid food, his appetite flickering back to life like a struggling candle flame. For the first time in what felt like an eternity, Alina heard her son laugh, a weak but genuine sound that brought tears. To her eyes, the townsfolk of Redemption watched with a mixture of awe and suspicion. Miracles were in short supply in this god-forsaken corner of Texas, and such an abrupt reversal of consumption's relentless march was unheard of. Whispers began to circulate, slithering through the general store and the saloon like desert snakes. What was in Dr. Finch's mysterious powder? What forbidden knowledge had he brought back with him from the old world? The doctor himself remained an enigma. He accepted Alina's tearful gratitude with a curt nod, his expression unreadable. When questioned by others about the boy's recovery, he offered only vague clinical explanations about a new regimen of nutrient-rich mineral compounds. This explanation satisfied no one. The mystery of the cure only deepened the unsettling aura that surrounded him. His practice swelled as the desperate and the dying flocked to his door, hoping for a miracle of their own. Yet even as they sought his help, their fear of him grew. He was a man who seemed to have power over death itself, and in a town so intimately acquainted with mortality, that was a terrifying and unnatural thing. The gray powder became a local legend, a forbidden hope whispered about in hushed tones. But a darker question began to fester beneath the surface of the town's relief. If Dr. Finch could command life, what was the price? And from what dark and macabre source did he draw his seemingly miraculous ingredients? The answer lay buried, quite literally, in the soil of redemption. The source of Dr. Finch's pharmacopoeia was a closely guarded secret, a matter of macabre logistics hidden behind a veneer of scientific detachment. While other physicians would place orders with suppliers in Galveston or St. Louis for quinine, laudanum, and carbolic acid, Dr. Finch's ledgers were conspicuously sparse. His most crucial ingredients were sourced locally, though not from any herbalist or apothecary. His supplier was a man named Silas Croft, the town's undertaker. Croft was a gaunt, somber man whose profession had stripped him of any sentimentality regarding the dead. He saw bodies as cargo, the final product of a brief and often brutal existence. His relationship with Dr. Finch was purely transactional, yet deeply unsettling. It had begun a few months after the doctor's arrival. Finch had approached Croft not with a request for burial services, but with a proposition that was both strange and lucrative. He wanted to purchase anatomical material, specifically bones. Not just any bones, however. He had precise requirements: femurs, tibias, sections of the skull, and vertebrae. Initially, he was interested only in the unclaimed bodies that ended up in the pauper's field, the anonymous drifters and outcasts who died with no family to mourn them and no money for a proper burial. For a generous sum of cash, Silas would allow the doctor clandestine access to the bodies before they were interred in their cheap pine boxes. It was a ghoulish business, conducted under the cover of darkness in Croft's morbid workshop. The undertaker would look the other way as the educated doctor, with the delicate hands of a surgeon, expertly dissected the pitiable remains, harvesting the specific pieces he required. Silas told himself it was no different from a butcher carving a side of beef. The dead had no use for their bones, but as the doctor's requests became more frequent and his payments more substantial, a cold unease began to settle in Silas Croft's soul. He was profiting from the desecration of the dead, fueling the doctor's horrifying and inexplicable research. He was a silent partner in a truly macabre enterprise, and the weight of that secret was beginning to feel as heavy as a tombstone. The pauper's field lay on the desolate outskirts of town, a patch of sun-baked earth marked by crude wooden crosses and mounds of slowly sinking soil. It was a place of profound sadness, the final, anonymous resting place for those who had left no mark on the world. It was here that the first truly disturbing signs began to appear. A ranch hand, taking a shortcut back to his bunkhouse at dusk, was the first to notice it. A fresh grave, one of an itinerant worker who had succumbed to heatstroke the week before, looked wrong. The earth was disturbed, mounded up in a way that suggested it had been recently excavated and hastily refilled. He dismissed it as the work of coyotes, scavengers growing bold in their hunger. But then, a few days later, the same phenomenon was observed at another grave, and then a third. The explanation of scavenging animals began to wear thin. Coyotes were messy. They would have left tracks, scattered bones, and torn scraps of burial shrouds. These sites were different. The earth was displaced, but the graves themselves seemed to have been opened with a deliberate, almost surgical precision. A sense of collective dread began to ripple through redemption. The sanctity of the grave was a fundamental tenet, even on the harsh frontier. The idea that someone was unearthing the dead was a violation that struck at the very heart of their fragile community. The town marshal, a grizzled, world-weary man named Jedediah Stone, was called to investigate. He was a practical man, not given to flights of fancy or superstition. He examined the sites, noted the lack of animal tracks and the careful way the sod had been cut and replaced. This was not the work of beasts. This was human. But who would do such a thing? Grave robbing was not unheard of, but thieves typically sought jewelry, gold teeth, or valuables buried with the deceased. These were paupers. They were buried with nothing but their worn-out clothes. Marshal Stone was left with a horrifying, illogical puzzle. Someone was digging up the poorest of the town's dead, but they weren't taking anything of value, or so it seemed. The truth was, they were taking the most valuable thing of all, the bodies themselves. As autumn began to lay its cool hand upon the scorched Texas landscape, the town's unease curdled into genuine fear. The desecration of graves was one thing, a creepy, morbid mystery. The disappearance of the living was another entirely. It began with a boy named Samuel, the 10-year-old son of the town blacksmith. He was a known wanderer, prone to chasing horny toads in the scrubland behind the town. One afternoon, he set off on one of his usual excursions and simply vanished. When he didn't return for supper, his father began to worry. By nightfall, the worry had turned to panic. Marshal Stone organized a search party. For 2 days, nearly every able-bodied man in Redemption combed the surrounding countryside, their lanterns cutting feeble swaths through the encroaching darkness. They called his name until their voices were raw, the sound swallowed by the vast, indifferent expanse of the plains. They found nothing. No sign of a struggle, no tracks leading off a cliff, no indication of an animal attack. It was as if the boy had been plucked from the earth by an unseen hand. The official theory, the one Marshal Stone was forced to present to the grieving family, was that Samuel had likely been taken by a mountain lion or had fallen into an undiscovered ravine. But in their hearts, the townsfolk knew better. This felt different. It felt sinister. The incident cast a dark pall over Redemption. Parents held their children closer, forbidding them from playing too far from home. A new, more potent fear now mingled with the daily hardships of frontier life. It was the fear of the unknown, of a predator that left no trace. The disturbed graves at the Pauper's Field were suddenly seen in a new, horrifying light. Before, it was a macabre mystery. Now it felt like a chilling prelude. Was there a connection? The thought was too monstrous for most to contemplate. But in the quiet, fearful corners of their minds, a terrible suspicion began to take root. The darkness that had been scratching at the edges of their town was no longer content with the dead. It was now coming for the living. Silas Croft, the undertaker, heard the news of Samuel's disappearance with a jolt of ice-cold terror. For weeks, he had been trying to ignore the gnawing guilt over his business with Dr. Finch. He had justified it, rationalized it, buried it under the weight of the silver dollars the doctor paid him. But now, with a child missing, the secret became an unbearable burden. He replayed every clandestine meeting, every unsettling conversation with the cold, calculating physician. He remembered the doctor's strange fascination with anatomy, his clinical questions about the state of the corpses, his specific requests for the bones of the young and the recently deceased. At the time, Silas had dismissed it as the eccentric obsession of a man of science. Now, it seemed utterly monstrous. The connection between the doctor's demand for human bones and the desecrated graves was obvious to him. Finch had clearly exhausted the supply of unclaimed bodies, and had taken to procuring his own specimens directly from the pauper's field. It was a horrifying realization, but what came next was even worse. What if the doctor's insatiable demand for anatomical material had escalated? What if the desecration of the dead was no longer enough to satisfy his macabre research? The thought was a venomous whisper in his mind. Was it possible that Dr. Finch, the town's celebrated healer, was involved in the boy's disappearance? It was a leap into a chasm of pure horror, an accusation so vile it seemed impossible. Yet the pieces fit together with a terrible, sickening logic. The doctor's secrecy, his cold demeanor, his unnatural medical successes, and his known hunger for human remains. Silas was trapped. To go to Marshal Stone with his suspicions would be to confess his own role in the ghoulish trade, to admit that he had been selling the bones of the dead. He would be ruined, possibly even arrested. But to remain silent, to carry the weight of this potential knowledge while a child was missing, that was a far heavier sentence. He was paralyzed by fear, caught between self-preservation and the dawning, horrifying certainty that the man of medicine in redemption was not a savior, but a monster hiding in plain sight. His silence was a form of complicity, and every passing moment felt like a betrayal to the missing boy. 2 weeks after Samuel vanished, it happened again. This time it was a young girl, Sarah, the daughter of a cotton farmer who lived on a small, isolated homestead a few miles east of town. She was last seen playing near the creek bed that ran behind their property. When the sun began to set, her mother called for her, but the only answer was the chirping of crickets and the lonely sigh of the wind. The pattern was terrifyingly similar to Samuel's disappearance. A massive search ensued, fueled by a new wave of collective panic and rage. Marshal Stone, his face etched with grim determination, led the searchers himself. They scoured every inch of the creek, every thicket of mesquite, every shadowy crevice in the rocky outcrops. They found one of her red hair ribbons snagged on a thorny bush near the water's edge, and nothing else. The town of Redemption was now officially in the grip of terror. This was no longer a string of isolated tragedies. It was a campaign of abduction by an unseen, unknown entity. The fragile bonds of the community began to fray. Suspicion, once directed outward at anonymous threats like bandits or nomadic tribes, now turned inward. Neighbor eyed neighbor. Old grudges and petty disputes were remembered, cast in a new, sinister light. The saloon, once a place of rowdy camaraderie, grew quiet and tense. Men drank silently, their eyes darting around the room, searching for a hint of darkness in familiar faces. The fear was a poison, seeping into the foundations of the town. Dr. Finch, however, seemed to be an island of calm in this sea of panic. He continued his work with the same detached efficiency, treating the coughs, fevers, and injuries of the terrified populace. His very composure became unsettling. How could he remain so unaffected by the horror that gripped everyone around him? To some, his steadiness was a comfort, a symbol of rationality in a world gone mad. But to a growing number, his cold indifference seemed unnatural. It was the calculated calm of a predator, not the concerned empathy of a healer. The questions that had once been whispered were now being spoken aloud. Where was the doctor on the afternoons the children disappeared? What secrets were locked away in the back rooms of his infirmary? The disappearance of a second child finally broke Silas Croft's silence. The undertaker, his face pale and gaunt with sleeplessness and dread, appeared at Marshal Jedediah Stone's office late one night. The small, cluttered room was lit by a single kerosene lamp that cast long, dancing shadows on the walls, making the wanted posters look like grim portraits of ghosts. Silas, his voice barely a whisper, confessed everything. He told the marshal about Dr. Finch's strange proposition, the late-night transactions, the cash payments for specific human bones harvested from the bodies of paupers. He recounted the doctor's clinical detachment, his almost academic interest in the macabre. As he spoke, the undertaker's shame was palpable, but it was overshadowed by a far greater fear of what the doctor might be truly capable of. Marshal Stone listened in stunned silence, his initial skepticism slowly giving way to a chilling sense of dread. The story was bizarre, almost unbelievable, yet it provided a disturbing thread that connected so many of the town's recent horrors. The desecrated graves were no longer a mystery. They were Dr. Finch's private, unholy quarry. This revelation was horrifying enough, but it immediately opened the door to a much darker possibility. If Finch was willing to exhume the dead for his research, what other lines would he be willing to cross? The marshal's mind raced, connecting the doctor's need for anatomical material with the two missing children. It was a monstrous hypothesis, one that accused the town's most educated man of being a child predator and murderer. But it was also the only theory that made a terrifying kind of sense. The marshal now faced a dreadful dilemma. Dr. Finch was a respected, influential figure. To accuse him of such heinous crimes without concrete evidence would be professional suicide. It could incite a riot or, worse, alert the doctor and allow him to destroy any proof of his guilt. He needed to be careful to be certain. He decided to pay Dr. Finch a visit, not as a lawman with an accusation, but as a potential patient, a concerned citizen. He would enter the lion's den himself, to look the monster in the eye and find the evidence he so desperately needed. Marshal Stone walked toward the doctor's infirmary the next afternoon, the dry dust of the street coating his boots. The building seemed to loom larger than the others, its windows like vacant eyes watching the town's descent into fear. He had concocted a believable ailment, a persistent ache in his shoulder from an old gunshot wound, as his pretext. The air inside the clinic was cool and smelled sharply of antiseptic and something else, something vaguely sweet and cloying that he couldn't quite place. Dr. Finch greeted him with his usual placid professional demeanor. "Marshal," he said, his voice smooth and even, "to what do I owe the visit? Has the strain of our town's recent troubles taken a physical toll?" The question was innocuous, yet it felt like a subtle jab, a test. Stone played his part, describing the fabricated pain in his shoulder. As the doctor examined him, his touch clinical and impersonal, the marshal's senses were on high alert. He scanned the room, his eyes cataloging every detail. The gleaming surgical instruments arranged in neat rows, the anatomical charts on the wall depicting the human skeletal structure in graphic detail, the heavy oak cabinet that he knew from Alina Vance's description held the doctor's proprietary compounds. The room was unnervingly clean, almost sterile. There was nothing overtly incriminating, nothing that screamed murderer. Yet the atmosphere itself felt heavy with secrets. The marshal steered the conversation as casually as he could toward the missing children. "It's a terrible business, doctor," he said, watching Finch's face for any reaction. "The whole town is on edge. People are imagining monsters in every shadow." Finch simply nodded, his expression unchanging. "Fear is a potent contagion, Marshal, often more dangerous than the disease itself. Hysteria clouds judgment." His composure was flawless, almost inhuman. He showed no fear, no anger, no sadness. Just a chilling, analytical detachment. The line between medicine and madness was already blurring in Redemption. If you find these forgotten chapters of history as compelling as we do, consider subscribing, because the town's descent into a living nightmare has only just begun. As Dr. Finch turned his back to prepare a liniment for the marshal's fictitious ailment, Stone's gaze fell upon a door at the far end of the examination room. It was a heavy, solid wood door, unlike the others in the building. It was fitted with a large, formidable iron lock, a stark contrast to the simple latches on the other doors. It was clearly a place the doctor did not want anyone entering. An overwhelming sense of certainty washed over the marshal. Whatever secrets Finch was hiding, the proof lay beyond that forbidden door. "What's in that room, doctor?" Stone asked, his tone shifting from that of a patient to that of a lawman. Finch paused, his hand hovering over a collection of glass bottles. He didn't turn around immediately. "That is my laboratory and storeroom, Marshal," he replied, his voice still unnervingly calm. "It contains volatile chemicals and sensitive equipment. For safety reasons, I must keep it locked." The explanation was plausible, logical, but the marshal didn't believe it. He could feel a cold energy emanating from that part of the building, a sense of deep wrongness. "I'd like to see it," Stone stated, his voice now hard as iron. Dr. Finch finally turned to face him. For the first time, the mask of detached professionalism slipped. A flicker of something cold and dangerous flashed in his gray eyes. "That is not possible. Patient confidentiality and the proprietary nature of my research forbid it." "I have a warrant," Stone lied, raising the stakes. He was bluffing, but he had to press the advantage. The doctor's composure, once his greatest defense, now began to look like a carefully constructed wall, and the marshal had just found the first crack. A tense silence filled the room. The smell of chemicals seemed to grow stronger. It was a standoff between two men, one representing the law, the other a dark, perverted version of science. The locked door between them had become the focal point of all the town's fear and suspicion. Marshal Stone knew, with a gut-wrenching certainty, that he could not leave this building without knowing what was behind it. The fate of the missing children, and perhaps the very soul of redemption, depended on it. Dr. Finch's eyes narrowed. "A warrant on what grounds, Marshal?" Vague suspicion, the ramblings of a terrified populace. His voice had taken on a sharp, condescending edge. He was trying to regain control, to use his intellect and social standing as a shield. But Marshal Stone did not back down. He took a step closer to the locked door, his hand resting on the butt of his Colt revolver. "On the grounds of Silas Croft's testimony," Stone said, his voice low and steady. "He told me everything, Doctor, about the bones, the late-night transactions, your requirements." At the mention of the undertaker's name, a visibly change came over Dr. Finch. The color drained from his face, and the mask of calm shattered completely, replaced by an expression of pure, unadulterated fury. He had been betrayed. His carefully constructed world of secrecy had been breached. For a moment, the civilized, educated doctor vanished, and in his place stood something primal and dangerous. "That drunken ghoul," Finch spat, the words dripping with venom. "He dares to accuse me after profiting from our arrangement." His admission, born of anger, was all the confirmation the marshal needed. The doctor saw the look of grim certainty on Stone's face and seemed to realize his mistake. He visibly reined in his anger, attempting to piece his composure back together, but it was too late. The confession was out. "Open the door, Doctor," the marshal commanded, his voice leaving no room for argument. "Open it now, or I will open it for you." Finch stared at the marshal, his mind clearly racing, calculating his options. Escape was impossible. Deception was no longer an option. The confrontation he had likely prepared for in the abstract landscape of his mind was now a stark, unavoidable reality. With a hand that trembled slightly with rage, not fear, Dr. Finch reached into his waistcoat pocket and produced a heavy, ornate iron key. The sound of the key scraping into the lock was unnaturally loud in the silent room, a sound that seemed to herald the unveiling of some great and terrible truth. The secrets of the Bone Doctor were about to be exposed. The heavy door swung inward with a low groan, releasing a wave of cold, stale air that carried a complex and horrifying odor. It was a nauseating cocktail of formaldehyde, carbolic acid, and something else, the sickeningly sweet, coppery smell of old blood. The room beyond was a vision from a nightmare. It was not a simple storeroom. It was a meticulously organized laboratory dedicated to the most macabre science imaginable. One wall was lined with shelves holding dozens of glass jars. They did not contain herbs or chemicals. They contained human organs, suspended in murky, yellowish fluid, each jar neatly labeled with a date and a source. Another wall was covered with detailed anatomical charts, far more graphic than the ones in the examination room, depicting the dismemberment of human bodies. But the centerpiece of the room, the object that drew the marshal's horrified gaze, was a large, cast-iron table in the center. It was stained with dark, dried fluids and fitted with leather straps, like a restraint table from an asylum. Next to it stood a piece of machinery that made the marshal's blood run cold, a heavy-duty industrial grinder, its gears and plates caked with a dried, grayish paste. On a smaller workbench against the far wall, the marshal saw the final, damning pieces of the puzzle. There were several small leather pouches, identical to the one described by Eleanor Vance, filled with the same grayish powder. Next to them was a ledger, its pages filled with the doctor's neat, precise handwriting. Marshall Stone picked it up, his hands numb. It wasn't a record of patients, it was a log of experiments. It detailed dosages, effects, and most horrifyingly, the source of the ingredients. The entries listed names, ages, and the specific bones harvested. The names of the paupers whose graves had been desecrated were all there. But as he flipped toward the most recent pages, his heart stopped. There, dated 2 weeks prior, was the name Samuel, and a few pages later, Sarah. Dr. Finch stood in the doorway, watching the marshal with a strange, unnerving placidity, as if observing a scientific experiment reaching its inevitable conclusion. There was no remorse in his eyes, no fear of the gallows. Instead, there was a chilling spark of intellectual pride. "You see, Marshal," he began, his voice taking on the quality of a university lecturer, "you are looking at the future of medicine. You see butchery, I see a new frontier of therapeutic science." Marshall Stone looked up from the horrifying ledger, his face a mask of revulsion and disbelief. "You call this science?" He managed to choke out, the words thick with disgust. "Those were children." "They were specimens," Finch corrected him, his tone sharp and dismissive. "Their deaths were tragic, of course, but not without purpose. In a world riddled with consumption, cholera, and countless other plagues, a radical solution is required. The established pharmacopoeia is laughably inadequate. I have theorized and now have proven that the vitality, the very essence of a healthy, living being, can be transferred." He gestured around the Macabre laboratory. "I was on the cusp of perfecting the process. The bones of the long dead were a crude starting point. Their vital properties were too degraded. I required fresh material, potent material. The young are the most potent of all. Their life force is undiluted." The confession was delivered without a hint of emotion. Cold recitation of a monstrous philosophy. In the doctor's twisted mind, he was not a murderer. He was a pioneer, a visionary sacrificing the few to save the many. He believed his work was a noble, if gruesome, necessity. He saw the missing children not as victims, but as unwilling donors to the cause of his groundbreaking research. Marshall Stone stared at the man, finally understanding the true depths of his depravity. This was not a crime of passion or greed. It was a crime born of a terrifying, arrogant intellect, completely untethered from morality, empathy, or any semblance of basic human decency. He was standing in the presence of a monster who genuinely believed he was a savior. The marshal's shock and revulsion quickly hardened into cold, focused rage. He drew his revolver, the click of the hammer being cocked echoing off the stone walls of the horrifying laboratory. "You're under arrest, Finch," he said, his voice dangerously quiet, "for the abduction and murder of Samuel Blackwood and Sarah Miller." Dr. Finch actually scoffed, a short, derisive sound of disbelief. "Arrest? Don't be a fool, Marshal. You cannot stop progress. Think of the lives my work will save. Thomas Vance is living proof. The boy was all but dead, and my compound brought him back from the brink. Is his life not worth the sacrifice of others who were likely to perish from hardship anyway?" His words were a venomous blend of logic and insanity, a justification so perverse that it momentarily stunned the marshal. The idea that Thomas's recovery was fueled by the literal essence of the missing children was a horror beyond comprehension. "Turn around." "Hands behind your back," Stone ordered, his voice shaking with restrained fury. For a moment it seemed Finch might resist. A flicker of defiance crossed his face. He glanced at the surgical tools on a nearby tray, scalpels, bone saws, tools of his trade, and potential weapons. But the marshal's aim was steady, his eyes promising swift and deadly retribution. The doctor, ever the pragmatist, seemed to calculate the odds and found them wanting. He slowly turned, his movements stiff with indignation, and placed his hands behind his back. As Marshall Stone holstered his weapon to retrieve his manacles, he felt a strange sense of unreality. The quiet, educated doctor who had treated the town's ailments was a killer of the most depraved kind. The infirmary, a place of healing, was a house of horrors. As he clamped the cold iron of the manacles around Finch's wrists, a new, sickening thought wormed its way into his mind. What was he going to tell the families? How could he possibly explain to Alina Vance that the miracle medicine that saved her son was created from the remains of her neighbor's murdered children? The arrest was just the beginning. The truth of this macabre affair would tear the town of Redemption apart. The walk from the infirmary to the small-town jail was the longest of Marshall Stone's life. He marched the manacled Dr. Finch down the center of the main street, the late afternoon sun casting long, dramatic shadows before them. Word of the arrest spread through the town like wildfire. People emerged from their homes and businesses, their faces a mixture of confusion, disbelief, and dawning horror. They saw their respected doctor in chains, being led by a grim-faced marshal, and they knew something terrible had happened. The whispers started immediately, morphing into a low, angry murmur that grew with every step. Silas Croft, watching from the doorway of his funeral parlor, looked pale and haunted, the living embodiment of a guilty conscience. Alina Vance stood on the porch of the general store, her son Thomas by her side, looking healthier than he had in years. She watched the procession with wide, uncomprehending eyes, a terrible confusion dawning on her face. The crowd followed them, a silent, menacing parade that swelled in size until it seemed the entire population of Redemption was trailing behind them. The atmosphere was thick with tension, a powder keg of grief and fear waiting for a spark. Marshall Stone could feel the collective gaze of the town on his back. He knew that revealing the full truth of Finch's crimes would unleash a storm of vengeance he might not be able to control. For now, he just needed to get the doctor safely behind bars. He shoved Finch into one of the two small, iron-barred cells and slammed the door shut, the sound of the bolt sliding home echoing through the tense silence. Dr. Finch, for his part, remained eerily composed. He sat on the edge of the simple cot, straightened his waistcoat, and looked out at the marshal with an expression of academic curiosity, as if this too were merely another phase of his experiment. The monster was caged, but the horror he had unleashed was only just beginning to poison the town. Marshall Stone knew he couldn't contain the truth for long. The blacksmith, Samuel's father, and the Millers, Sarah's parents, were already at his office door, their faces desperate for answers. He took them inside, away from the growing crowd, and in the grim confines of his office, he laid out the horrifying facts. He told them about the secret laboratory, the ledger, and the doctor's monstrous confession. The reaction was not loud or explosive. It was a deep, soul-shattering implosion of grief and disbelief. Mrs. Miller collapsed into a chair, a silent scream frozen on her face. Mr. Blackwood, a mountain of a man who could shape iron with his bare hands, simply stared at the floor, tears carving clean tracks through the soot on his cheeks as the full, unimaginable horror of his son's fate settled upon him. The news ripped through the crowd outside like a physical blow. Disbelief gave way to rage, a collective, primal howl of fury. The low murmur erupted into a roar. The men of the town, who had spent days searching fruitlessly for the missing children, were now confronted with the truth that the predator had been living among them all along, masquerading as a healer. The mob's focus shifted from the marshal's office to the jailhouse next door. Cries of "Lynch him" and "Give him to us" filled the air. Torches were lit. Even though the sun had not yet set, their flickering flames a testament to the burning hatred that had consumed the town. The crowd surged toward the jail, their faces contorted with a righteous, terrifying fury. Marshall Stone stood on the steps, his shotgun held across his chest. He was one man against the righteous anger of an entire town. He understood their rage, felt a measure of it himself, but his duty was clear. Finch deserved a trial, a proper hanging decreed by a judge, not a bloody, chaotic execution at the hands of a lynch mob. "Stand down," he yelled, his voice barely audible over the din. "Justice will be done, but it will be done by the law." But the people of Redemption were no longer interested in the law. They were interested in vengeance, swift and brutal. The mob was a living entity, a many-headed beast fueled by grief and rage. They saw Marshall Stone not as a protector of order, but as an obstacle to the justice they so desperately craved. Mr. Blackwood, the blacksmith, his face a mask of terrible grief, pushed his way to the front. "That thing in there took my boy Jedediah," he roared, his voice cracking with pain. "He doesn't deserve a trial. He deserves to be torn apart." The crowd roared its agreement. They surged forward, a wave of humanity threatening to break over the marshal and the flimsy wooden jailhouse. Stone stood his ground, knowing that if he fired on them, he would ignite a civil war in the middle of the street. Inside his cell, Dr. Finch watched the scene unfold with that same chilling detachment. He showed no fear, only a kind of clinical interest in the sociology of the mob. He was a scientist to the very end, observing the raw, primal emotions he had so thoroughly purged from himself. The marshal tried to reason with them, to appeal to their sense of decency, but it was like trying to reason with a hurricane. These were good people, driven to a dark place by an unspeakable evil. They had been betrayed in the most intimate way imaginable. The man they had trusted with their lives, and the lives of their children, had used that trust to turn them into monsters. As the first stone struck the wall of the jailhouse, Marshal Stone knew he was losing control. The sun was setting, casting the entire scene in a blood-red light. The flickering torches of the mob threw long, dancing shadows, making the enraged faces look demonic. Redemption was on the verge of consuming itself in a fire of its own making, a fire ignited by the horrifying secrets of the man in the cage. The doctor's evil was not contained to his laboratory. It was a contagion that was now infecting the entire town. It was the arrival of Eleanor Vance that finally broke the terrible momentum of the mob. She pushed her way through the angry crowd, holding her son Thomas by the hand. The boy, the living symbol of the doctor's macabre success, looked bewildered and frightened by the scene. Eleanor's face was a wreck of conflicting emotions, confusion, horror, and a dawning, soul-crushing guilt. She stopped before the steps of the jail, facing the marshal and the angry townsfolk. "Is it true?" she asked, her voice trembling but carrying over the noise of the crowd. "The medicine, what was in it?" Marshal Stone couldn't bring himself to say the words. He simply gave her a slow, grim nod. The confirmation struck Eleanor with the force of a physical blow. She staggered back, her hand flying to her mouth. She looked down at her son, at his rosy cheeks and clear eyes, and saw not a miracle of medicine, but a product of murder. She had saved her child by feeding him the remains of another. The horrifying realization spread through the crowd like a shockwave, quieting their rage and replacing it with a profound, collective sense of sickness. Every parent who had considered visiting Dr. Finch, every person who had marveled at Thomas's recovery, was now implicated in the horror. Their desperation, their hope, had made them unwitting consumers of a forbidden and monstrous cure. The revelation was a splash of icy water on their burning rage. The fury of the mob began to dissipate, replaced by a much colder, heavier feeling of communal shame and revulsion. They were no longer just the victims of a monster, they were participants in his horrifying experiment. The torches still burned, but the hands that held them trembled. They looked at the jailhouse, at Eleanor and her son, and at each other, and saw the full, tangled, and obscene scope of Dr. Finch's evil. He hadn't just killed children, he had corrupted the very hope of the living. With the mob's righteous fury momentarily blunted by the horrifying revelation, Marshal Stone seized the opportunity. He deputized a few of the more level-headed men in the crowd, including a shaken but resolute Mr. Miller, Sarah's father. Together, they managed to disperse the rest of the townsfolk, urging them to go home, to be with their families, to lock their doors against the darkness that had been so brutally exposed. The streets of Redemption emptied, leaving an eerie silence broken only by the chirping of crickets and the low sobbing of those whose grief was too profound to contain. The town was wounded, perhaps mortally. The trust that binds a community together had been irrevocably shattered. That night, Marshal Stone sat in his office, the jailhouse key heavy on his desk, and contemplated his next move. He would have to send a rider to the county seat at first light to fetch a circuit judge. A proper trial would have to be held, evidence presented, a sentence passed down. It was the way of the law, the way of civilization. But Redemption no longer felt civilized. It felt cursed, tainted by a knowledge that could never be unlearned. He thought about Dr. Finch, sitting calmly in his cell just a few feet away. The man's lack of remorse was perhaps the most disturbing part of it all. How could a human being become so disconnected from his own humanity? What dark path had he walked in those hallowed halls of European science to arrive at such a monstrous philosophy? The marshal shuddered as he remembered the ledger, the cold, meticulous entries detailing the harvesting of children. The doctor's work was a perversion of everything medicine was supposed to stand for. He hadn't healed. He had desecrated, turning life into a ghoulish commodity. The quiet of the night offered no peace, only a void where the town's innocence used to be. The marshal knew that even after the judge came and the gallows were built, the ghost of Dr. Alastair Finch and his macabre prescriptions would haunt redemption forever. The bone doctor was locked away, but his poison was still spreading. Inside his cell, Dr. Alastair Finch was not idle. He was not pacing or weeping or praying for his soul. He was observing. He watched the way the moonlight slanted through the barred window, analyzed the emotional exhaustion on the marshal's face, and listened to the sounds of a town grieving. To him, it was all data. He felt no guilt for his actions, only a profound intellectual frustration that his great work had been interrupted by the sentimental ignorance of lesser men. He viewed the people of redemption as little more than lab rats, incapable of understanding the profound importance of his research. Their grief was an irrational biological response, an obstacle to progress. He had offered them a cure for one of humanity's greatest scourges, and they were going to hang him for it. The irony was, in his view, staggering. As the night wore on, he began to meticulously review his circumstances, not with fear but with the cold logic of a chess master assessing a losing board. Escape was unlikely. Rescue was impossible. A trial was a certainty, and its outcome was preordained. The marshal would present the laboratory, the ledger, and his own confession. The jury, composed of the very people whose children he had experimented on, would convict him in minutes. The gallows awaited. He considered his legacy. He would be remembered as a monster, a fiend, a butcher of children. His groundbreaking work in osteotherapeutics, the radical science of transferring vitality through mineralized human essence, would be buried with him, banned from medical journals and dismissed as the ravings of a madman. This, to him, was the only true tragedy. The loss of the children was a calculated, necessary expense. The loss of his knowledge was a catastrophe for all of mankind. In the cold, silent darkness of his cell, surrounded by the hatred of an entire town, Dr. Alastair Finch did not contemplate his sins. He mourned the ignorance of a world that was not ready for his genius, and he began to formulate one final, macabre act to ensure his work would not be forgotten entirely. The following morning, Marshal Stone sent his deputy on the long ride to the county seat. It would be 2, maybe 3 days before he returned with the judge. 3 days that the marshal would have to spend keeping a lid on the simmering pot of the town's rage and guarding the most hated man in Texas. He approached the jailhouse with a sense of profound weariness. He had barely slept, haunted by the images from the doctor's laboratory. He carried a tray with a plate of stale bread and a cup of water, the standard fare for a prisoner. When he reached Finch's cell, he was greeted by an unnerving silence. The doctor was not sitting on his cot, nor was he standing at the bars. He was lying on the floor, perfectly still. A dark blackish fluid stained his lips and chin, and trickled from the corner of his mouth onto the stone floor. An empty, uncorked vial lay near his outstretched hand. The marshal's heart sank. He fumbled with the key, his hands shaking, and threw open the cell door. Dr. Finch was dead. There was no doubt. His eyes were open, fixed on the ceiling with that same look of detached scientific curiosity he had worn in life. He had taken poison, a fast-acting concoction he must have had hidden on his person, a final contingency plan. On the cot lay a single sheet of paper, folded neatly. It was not a confession, nor was it an apology. It was a suicide note, but one unlike any the marshal had ever seen. It was written in the doctor's precise, elegant script, and it was addressed not to the law or to God but to the future. The marshal was now faced with a horrifying possibility, one that defied all reason. We dig deep to unearth these banned stories that official history tries to forget. Hit the like button if you believe the truth, no matter how macabre must be told. The note was a manifesto of madness, a final, defiant testament to his horrifying philosophy. It began not with remorse but with a declaration. Let it be known that I, Dr. Alastair Finch, was a pioneer, not a murderer. I die a martyr to progress, silenced by the ignorant superstitions of an age that still fears the dark. He went on to describe his theories in chilling, scientific detail. He called his work vital essence transference, postulating that the human skeleton acted as a kind of organic battery, storing the life force of the individual. He claimed that by pulverizing the bones of the young and vital, this energy could be released and ingested, replenishing the depleted life force of the sick and dying. He described his murders of the children as necessary acquisitions of premium-grade material, and lamented that he had not had time to refine the process further, to find a way to extract the essence without the crude necessity of terminating the subject. He ended the note with a chilling and prophetic warning. You will hang my body and burn my books, but you cannot kill an idea. Others will follow my path. They will work in secret, away from the prying eyes of the sentimental masses. The science of human vitality is now born, and it has been paid for in blood. Do not mourn the specimens I took. Pity the generations you have condemned to suffer and die from diseases I was so close to conquering. Marshall Stone read the letter twice, his blood running cold. The man was a monster to the very end, utterly convinced of his own righteousness. His suicide was not an act of cowardice or remorse. It was a final, arrogant act of control. He had denied the town its justice, denied the hangman his rope, and transformed himself from a common murderer into a self-proclaimed martyr for a banned and terrible science. The physical threat of Dr. Finch was gone, but his intellectual poison, the horrifying ideology spelled out in the note, felt more dangerous than ever. It was an idea that could, in the wrong hands, crawl out of the grave and find new life. The news of Dr. Finch's suicide was met not with relief, but with a profound and unsettling sense of anticlimax. The town's thirst for vengeance had been thwarted. There would be no trial, no public condemnation, no satisfying spectacle of the doctor meeting his end at the gallows. He had escaped, in his own way, robbing them of their closure. The rage that had united them now curdled into a sullen, lingering resentment. The townsfolk gathered that afternoon, and in a final, cathartic act of purgation, they burned his infirmary to the ground. They dragged everything out into the street, the examination table, the anatomical charts, the books, and every last bottle of medicine. They smashed the jars of preserved organs, the horrifying trophies of his work, and doused the entire building in kerosene. The flames rose high into the Texas sky, a massive funeral pyre for the town's innocence. They cheered as the roof collapsed, as the walls turned to charcoal, hoping that the fire could somehow cleanse the stain of the doctor's presence from their town. But it was a hollow gesture. They could burn the building, but they could not burn the memory of what had happened there. They could not erase the knowledge that the man they had trusted was a monster, nor could they forget the horrifying nature of his crimes. As the embers of the infirmary died down, a new and more insidious set of whispers began to circulate through redemption. The doctor was dead, but his legacy remained. It remained in the haunted eyes of the parents who had lost their children. It remained in the confused and troubled mind of Eleanor Vance, and most disturbingly of all, it remained in the body of her son, Thomas. The boy was the living, breathing result of Finch's forbidden science. He was a walking, talking testament to the doctor's macabre success, and the town began to look at him differently. Thomas Vance, once the subject of the town's pity, then its awe, now became an object of fear and suspicion. He was a constant, living reminder of the horrifying bargain that had been struck. Parents would hurry their own children inside when he walked by. Old friends would no longer play with him. Whispers followed him everywhere he went. They said the boy was different, that there was a coldness in his eyes that hadn't been there before. They said he was unnaturally strong for his age, that he rarely got sick, even with common colds. These were likely just the projections of a traumatized community, seeing monsters in shadows. But the fear was real. Was it possible that the medicine had done more than just cure his consumption? Had he ingested not just the vitality, but something of the essence, the very spirit of the children whose bones he had consumed? It was a superstitious, irrational fear, but it took hold of the town's imagination. Eleanor Vance found herself isolated, a pariah by association. The miracle of her son's survival had become her curse. She saw the fear in her neighbor's eyes and began to fear it herself. She would watch Thomas as he slept, searching his peaceful face for any sign of the darkness that now haunted their lives. Was he truly her son, or some horrifying hybrid, a life purchased with the currency of death? The weight of this question, combined with the town's shunning, became unbearable. A few months after the doctor's suicide, Eleanor packed their few belongings onto a small wagon in the dead of night. She left a note for the marshal, thanking him for his kindness, but stating that she and Thomas could no longer live in a place so saturated with grief and suspicion. They vanished into the vast, anonymous landscape of the West, seeking a place where they could escape the long shadow of the Bone Doctor. No one in Redemption ever saw or heard from them again. Their disappearance added another layer of myth to the already dark legend. The departure of Eleanor and Thomas Vance did not heal the wound in Redemption. It only allowed it to fester in new and stranger ways. With the living evidence of the doctor's work gone, the story began to mutate, to evolve from a horrific crime into a full-blown piece of macabre folklore. The burned-out shell of the infirmary became a haunted landmark, a place children dared each other to approach at dusk. It was said that on quiet nights, you could still hear the sound of a grinder turning in the blackened ruins and the faint cries of children. The story of Dr. Finch, the Bone Doctor, became a cautionary tale whispered to misbehaving children, a local boogeyman far more terrifying than any mythical creature. The details became more gruesome and supernatural with each retelling. Some said the doctor had not just used bones, but had cooked and eaten the flesh of his victims. Others claimed his suicide was a hoax, that he had used his dark knowledge to fake his own death and escape, and that he still roamed the desolate plains, searching for new specimens. But the most persistent and disturbing legend was the one concerning his medicine. A rumor took hold that the marshal had not destroyed all of the doctor's gray powder, that he had kept a small pouch, locked away in his safe. Why? The storytellers offered a chilling explanation: because it worked. The legend claimed that despite its horrifying origins, the medicine was a true panacea, a cure for any ailment, a veritable fountain of youth derived from the most forbidden source. It was a tempting and terrible idea, that ultimate healing could be found through ultimate evil. This disturbing piece of folklore hinted at a deep, unsettling ambiguity. The doctor was a monster, yes, but was he also, in his own twisted way, a genius who had stumbled upon a horrifying truth of biology? This question became the heart of the curse of Redemption, a moral poison that lingered long after the ashes of the infirmary had grown cold. The town of Redemption did not recover. The events of 1884 had inflicted a mortal wound upon its collective psyche. The community, once bound by shared hardship, was now fractured by shared trauma and suspicion. Families began to drift away, seeking to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the cursed town. The blacksmith, unable to live with the memory of his son, sold his forge for a pittance and moved west. The Millers followed soon after, the silence of their empty farmhouse a constant, screaming reminder of their loss. With each departing family, the town shrank, its lifeblood draining away into the dust. The businesses that had once served a thriving community began to fail. The general store saw less and less traffic, its shelves gathering dust. The saloon grew quiet, the few remaining patrons drinking in morose silence. The vibrant energy of a frontier town was replaced by the lethargic decay of a place with no future. Marshal Jedediah Stone remained, a lonely sentinel presiding over the town's slow demise. He grew old in his office, the memory of Dr. Finch a constant, unwelcome companion. He never spoke of the incident, and he kept the doctor's suicide note locked in his safe, a dark secret he would take to his grave. He watched as redemption slowly withered, building by building, until it was little more than a ghost town, a collection of sun-bleached skeletons on the vast, empty plains. The curse of the Bone Doctor had not been a supernatural one, but a psychological one. He had shown the people of redemption the monster that could lurk behind a civilized face, and he had revealed the terrifying fragility of their own morality in the face of desperation. They had looked into the abyss, and the abyss had stared back, and they could no longer pretend it wasn't there. The town had been built on hope, but it died from a horrifying truth. What became of the science, the horrifying ideology that Dr. Finch had championed in his final note? The official records of the events in Redemption are sparse, almost non-existent. The circuit judge who eventually arrived found a dead prisoner in a burned-down building. The official report lists the deaths of the children as unsolved abductions and the death of Dr. Finch as a suicide by a person of interest. The more lurid details, the laboratory, the grinder, the medicine made from human bones, were omitted, deemed too inflammatory and disturbing for public record. The story was effectively banned, buried in the bureaucratic archives of the county, a footnote in the violent history of the Texas frontier. But as Dr. Finch himself predicted, an idea once born is not so easily killed. His suicide note, which Marshall Stone presumably kept hidden until his death, represented a dangerous and seductive concept. The notion of transferring life force, of using the young to rejuvenate the old, is a theme that has echoed through the darker corners of folklore and occultism for centuries. It taps into the most primal human fears of aging and death, and the equally primal temptation to overcome them at any cost. Is it possible that Finch was not alone in his thinking? That he was part of a hidden, underground network of researchers exploring these forbidden frontiers of medicine? His education in Europe, a hotbed of both scientific progress and esoteric societies, suggests he may have been exposed to these radical ideas before he ever set foot in Redemption. Perhaps his work in the isolated Texas town was not the beginning of this dark science, but simply one failed, brutally exposed experiment in a much larger, ongoing effort. The official history tells us that the horror ended with Dr. Finch's death, but the silence in the records feels less like a conclusion and more like a deliberate cover-up, a curtain drawn over a stage where a much larger and more terrifying play might still be unfolding. The legacy of this case extends far beyond the haunted plains of Texas. The core concept of Dr. Finch's work, using human material for medicinal or restorative purposes, is a deeply unsettling but recurring theme in human history. From ancient rituals involving cannibalism to obtain an enemy's strength, to the ghoulish mummy medicine of Renaissance Europe, where powdered Egyptian mummies were prescribed for a variety of ailments, humanity has long flirted with this ultimate taboo. These practices were often rooted in a magical or symbolic belief system, the idea that one could consume the spirit or properties of another human being. Dr. Finch's contribution was to take this ancient, superstitious horror and clothe it in the modern, respectable language of science. He replaced magic with biology, spirit with vital essence. He transformed a ghoulish taboo into a therapeutic paradigm. This is what makes his case so uniquely disturbing. He represents a terrifying bridge between the ancient, superstitious horrors of the past and the cold, godless horrors of the modern era. His crimes were not those of a simple madman, but of a man who possessed a powerful intellect and a complete lack of a moral compass. He demonstrated how easily tools of reason, science, and medicine can be perverted to serve the most monstrous of ends. The story of redemption serves as a chilling reminder that the pursuit of knowledge without the guidance of empathy is a path to atrocity. The doctor who prescribed human bones as medicine was not just a killer. He was a dark prophet of a new kind of horror, one where the laboratory can become more terrifying than any haunted crypt, and the most dangerous monster is the one who believes he is saving humanity. Let us reconsider the central, most disturbing question of this entire affair. Did the medicine actually work? The evidence is unsettlingly ambiguous. The narrative of redemption tells us that Thomas Vance made a full and remarkable recovery from a terminal case of consumption. The townsfolk witnessed it. Eleanor Vance lived it. Dr. Finch, in his own notes, documented it as a resounding success, proof of his theory. It is easy to dismiss this as a coincidence, a spontaneous remission, or perhaps the result of a powerful placebo effect acting on a desperate mother and her ailing child. These are rational, comforting explanations, but are they the truth? The historical context is crucial. In 1884, consumption was a virtual death sentence. Spontaneous remission was extraordinarily rare. The treatments available were largely ineffective, focused more on managing symptoms than curing the underlying disease. For Thomas to not only survive but to thrive is, by the standards of the time, a genuine medical anomaly. We are left with a horrifying possibility that Dr. Finch, through his depraved and murderous methods, had actually stumbled upon something real. That his vile concoction, for all its moral monstrosity, possessed some genuine therapeutic property. This is perhaps the most challenging aspect of the legend. It denies us the simple comfort of dismissing Finch as a charlatan and a madman. It forces us to confront the possibility that he was a monster and a genius, that his evil was not just destructive, but also, in a terrifyingly twisted way, creative. The idea that a cure for one of humanity's deadliest diseases could be derived from the murder of children is a moral paradox of the highest order. It suggests that some truths in the universe may be so horrifying that they are better left undiscovered, that some doors of knowledge are banned for a very good reason. The true horror is not just what the doctor did, but the chilling possibility that he was right. The fate of Thomas Vance remains one of the most compelling and unresolved threads of this dark tapestry. He and his mother disappeared into the American West, becoming ghosts in their own time. What would a life built on such a horrifying foundation look like? Assuming they successfully changed their names and started anew, the secret they carried would have been a constant, silent presence. For Eleanor, every look at her healthy son would be a reminder of the price that was paid for his life. A price paid in the lives of other children. It is a psychological burden almost too heavy to comprehend. And what of Thomas himself? He was young when it happened, but as he grew older, would his mother have told him the truth? Or would she have let the secret die with her, allowing him to live in blissful ignorance? The folklore that grew up around him in redemption, that he was different, colder, unnaturally robust, raises even more disturbing questions. If Dr. Finch's theory of vital essence transference had any merit, what exactly did Thomas ingest along with the pulverized bones? Did he absorb some echo of the personalities, the memories, the very souls of Samuel and Sarah? Could a person's life force truly be distilled and consumed like a chemical compound? This ventures into the realm of the supernatural, but the crime itself was so far outside the bounds of normal human behavior that such questions feel strangely appropriate. The story of Thomas Vance is the story of the ultimate survivor, but his survival is tainted by the deepest possible stain. He is the boy who lived, but his life casts the shadow of two who died. His unknown fate leaves a gaping hole in the narrative, a lingering, haunting question about whether a life saved by such macabre means can ever truly be a normal one. Let us return to the scene of the crime, the town of Redemption itself. Today, no such town exists on any map of Texas. Historians and folklorists who have tried to pinpoint its exact location have found only conflicting accounts and dead ends. Some believe the name itself was a fiction, a grimly ironic moniker created by the storytellers who preserved the legend. Others believe the town was real but was so thoroughly abandoned and erased from the landscape that nothing remains but shifting dust and whispering winds. This geographical vanishing act adds a powerful layer of myth to the story. The tale of the Bone Doctor exists in a kind of historical limbo, not quite fact, not quite fiction. It has all the hallmarks of a grand, gothic horror novel, yet it is persistently told as a true story, a piece of forbidden history passed down through generations. Is it possible that the entire story is just that, a story? A cautionary tale created to warn against the dangers of placing blind faith in science, or a grim piece of frontier folklore designed to explain the harsh realities of death and disease? Perhaps. But the story's persistence, its specific and unflinching details, suggests it may have a kernel of truth. Perhaps a real series of crimes, a real doctor with a dark secret was the seed from which this monstrous legend grew. The town's name, Redemption, is a bitter irony. No one in the story finds redemption. The victims are not redeemed from death, the doctor is not redeemed from his evil, and the town is not redeemed from its trauma. It is a story about damnation. The fact that the town itself is now gone, that it cannot be found, feels poetically just. A place so thoroughly cursed, so tainted by an unforgettable evil, was perhaps fated to be wiped from the face of the earth, becoming a ghost town in both a literal and a metaphorical sense, its location as much a cold case as the full truth of what happened there. The story of the Bone Doctor of Redemption forces us to confront the dark relationship between desperation and morality. The people of the town were not evil. Eleanor Vance was not a monster. She was a loving mother pushed to the absolute limit of her endurance, willing to do anything to save her child. It was this desperation that Dr. Finch exploited so masterfully. He understood that when hope is gone, people will not ask too many questions. They will accept the miracle and turn a blind eye to the methods. In this, the story is a powerful allegory. How often do we, as a society, accept cures and comforts without fully interrogating their source? We are the beneficiaries of a scientific and industrial progress that has often been built on a foundation of exploitation and suffering, from the horrific medical experiments of the past to the brutal labor conditions of the present. We are all, in some small way, consumers of miracles with hidden costs. Dr. Finch is the ultimate embodiment of this dark bargain. He offers a perfect solution, a cure for death itself, at the most abhorrent price imaginable. The choice he puts before the people of redemption is a horrifying one. Do you let your child die, or do you save him with a medicine made from murder? While Eleanor did not know the full truth, her willingness to use a secret, unconventional compound speaks to the moral compromises that desperation can breed. The doctor's evil could not have existed in a vacuum. It required the fertile soil of a community racked by hopelessness. He was the predator, but the town's despair was the ecosystem in which he hunted. It is a chilling reminder that the line between victim and accomplice can sometimes be terrifyingly thin. In the end, what lingers most is the profound sense of the unresolved. The suicide of Dr. Finch, while providing a definitive end to his physical existence, offered no real answers. He died unpunished by the law and completely unrepentant, clinging to his monstrous ideology until the very end. His death did not bring justice. It simply locked the door on a room full of secrets. We are left with a cascade of haunting questions that echo through the years. Did he act alone, or was he part of a larger, more secretive movement exploring the forbidden frontiers of medicine? What became of Thomas Vance, the boy who was the living product of this macabre science? Did he live a normal life, or was he forever changed by the horrifying cure that saved him? And perhaps the most unsettling question of all, hidden in the doctor's madness, was there a spark of genuine, revolutionary discovery? The story occupies a space between history and nightmare, a place where the verifiable facts end and the chilling possibilities begin. The official record is silent, the town is gone, and the main actors are all lost to time. All that remains is the story itself, a piece of oral tradition that functions as a grim warning. It is a tale about the darkness that can hide behind the mask of intellect and progress, and the terrifying lengths to which humanity will go to defy its own mortality. The legend of the Bone Doctor is a cold case in the truest sense of the word, not just because the crimes went officially unpunished, but because the central, most horrifying mysteries at its heart remain, and likely will forever remain, unsolved. The truth was buried with the doctor, and perhaps it is better that way. The dust of the Texas plains has long since settled over the phantom town of Redemption. The wooden markers of the pauper's field have rotted away, and the patch of blackened earth where the infirmary once stood is now likely overgrown with mesquite and prickly pear. The story, too, has faded, retreating from common knowledge into the shadowed archives of macabre folklore. It exists now only as a whisper, a chilling tale for those who seek out the darkest corners of history. But the silence that surrounds this story is not empty. It is heavy with the weight of its implications. It reminds us that the history we read is often a sanitized version of the truth, that the most disturbing stories are frequently the ones that are deliberately erased, banned from the official narrative. The tale of Dr. Alastair Finch and his medicine of human bone is a stark and brutal testament to the idea that the most profound horrors are not born of ghosts or demons, but from the chillingly rational mind of a human being completely devoid of a soul. It is a story that stays with you, that creeps under your skin, because it explores the ultimate taboo, the consumption of our own kind, not for survival, but for a cure. It leaves us with a final, lingering sense of dread, and a question we are almost afraid to ask. In our modern world, with its genetic engineering and radical medical technologies, are we certain that a new Dr. Finch is not, right now, working quietly in some hidden laboratory, pursuing a noble goal through monstrous means, all in the name of progress?